There's a fortress in the Austrian Alps, perched on a rock pillar 500 feet high, surrounded by snow-capped mountains that cut into the sky like broken teeth, visible for miles in every direction. Beautiful, if you ignore what happened inside. Because for centuries, this fortress wasn't just a military installation, it was a prison, a place where powerful men, archbishops, governors, nobles who'd angered the wrong people, were sent to disappear, not executed. That would be too merciful, too quick. They were imprisoned, in cells carved from rock, in chambers so cold your breath froze before it left your lungs, in isolation so complete you'd forget your own name before you saw another human face. And if you look closely at the walls, particularly in the residential quarters, where the most important prisoners were kept, you'll see something: scratches, carvings, marks made by fingernails and makeshift tools, messages from men who knew they'd never leave, who scratched their names into stone because it was the only way to prove they'd existed, the only way to leave something behind when everything else was being taken from them. One inscription stands out, clear, deliberate, carved with precision despite the emotional turmoil that must have accompanied its creation. Wolf Dietrich von Reitenau, 1611. An archbishop, a prince, one of the most powerful men in Salzburg, imprisoned in the very fortress he once controlled, by his own nephew, for crimes that were as much political as criminal. He would spend 6 years here. 6 years watching the Alpine seasons change through a narrow window. 6 years listening to the wind howl through the mountains. 6 years dying slowly from cold and isolation, and the knowledge that he'd been betrayed by family. He died in this fortress, never freed, never forgiven. His body carried down the mountain to be buried, his name carved into the wall, his story absorbed into the stones. This is Hohenwerfen Castle, the prison fortress of the Alps. For the next 2 hours, I'll take you through 9 centuries of warfare, imprisonment, and power. We'll explore a castle that was never conquered by enemies, but turned its strength inward, using its impregnable defenses not to protect the realm, but to break its prisoners. We'll meet the archbishops who built it as a symbol of divine authority, the peasant armies that nearly destroyed it, the Nazis who used it for their own sinister purposes. We'll descend into dungeons where nobles starved, walk through chambers where ecclesiastical prisoners contemplated their sins, stand at windows where men looked out at freedom they would never taste again. The fortress stands waiting. The walls remember everything, every scream that echoed through the stone corridors, every prayer whispered in solitary confinement, every name carved by prisoners who knew they'd been forgotten by the world outside. Let's ascend to the Eagle's Nest, to the fortress that made even the powerful fear its shadow. Chapter 1. The Investiture Controversy and the Birth of a Fortress. Our story begins with a conflict that would shape Europe for generations. The Investiture Controversy, a power struggle between the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor. A question that seems simple, but whose answer would determine the fate of nations. Who has the right to appoint bishops? The Pope argued that only the Church could choose its own leaders, that secular rulers had no authority over spiritual matters, that bishops answered to God through the Pope, not to earthly kings. The Emperor disagreed, violently, because bishops weren't just religious leaders. They were princes, rulers of vast territories, controllers of armies and wealth. Appointing a bishop meant appointing an ally, or an enemy, meant placing your supporter or your opponent in control of strategic lands. The controversy exploded in 1075. Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV. Henry declared Gregory deposed. Europe split into factions. Armies marched. Alliances formed and shattered. And in Salzburg, Archbishop Gebhard von Helfenstein made a choice. He sided with the Pope, publicly, definitively. In a political environment where neutrality was the only safe option, Gebhard declared his allegiance to Gregory VII against the emperor who controlled half of Europe. It was brave, it was principled, it was also potentially suicidal, because Henry IV wasn't the type of emperor who tolerated defiance. He'd humbled the Pope himself, forcing Gregory to absolve his excommunication after Henry stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa for 3 days. He'd crushed rebellions, destroyed cities, made examples of those who opposed him. And now Archbishop Gebhard, ruler of Salzburg, one of the most important archbishoprics in the Holy Roman Empire, had declared himself the Pope's man. Henry's response was predictable, inevitable. He would invade Salzburg, depose Gebhard, install a more compliant archbishop, make it clear what happened to church leaders who forgot their place in the imperial order. Gebhard knew this, understood exactly what he'd invited, but he'd made his choice. Now he had to prepare for the consequences. He ordered the construction of 3 fortresses, a triangle of defensive positions protecting Salzburg from invasion: Hohensalzburg Fortress in the city itself, Petersburg Castle in Friesach, and a 3rd fortress, the most strategically crucial, at a place called Hohenwerfen. The location was perfect, terrifying, brilliant, a rock pillar rising 155 meters above the Salzach River Valley, sheer cliffs on every side, a natural fortress that seemed designed by God specifically for this purpose. Controlling the only route south from Salzburg, the narrow Lueg Pass that armies had to traverse to reach the city. Build a castle here, and you controlled access to Salzburg. Hold this position, and no army could pass without your permission. Construction began in 1075. It was rushed, desperate. The emperor's forces were already mobilizing. Gebhard didn't have time for elaborate planning or careful architecture. He needed walls, towers, defensible positions. He needed them now. The initial structure was likely wooden, fast to build, cheap, temporary, but occupying the crucial high ground while permanent fortifications could be constructed. Within 3 years, Hohenwerfen was complete, a stone fortress rising from the rock, walls 10 feet thick at the base, a central tower, a Burgfried that watched over the valley like a sentinel, a small chapel for spiritual sustenance, living quarters for the garrison. Not large, not luxurious, but functional, defendable, impregnable, and just in time. Because in 1077, Henry IV invaded. His forces swept through Salzburg like a flood. Gebhard's supporters scattered. The city fell. The emperor installed his own candidate as archbishop, one who understood the proper relationship between church and crown. But Hohenwerfen held. Henry's forces reached the fortress, looked up at those walls, at the sheer cliffs, at the narrow approach that would force attackers into a killing ground where defenders could rain down arrows and rocks and boiling oil, and they decided it wasn't worth it. The fortress was too strong, the position too advantageous. Sieging Hohenwerfen would cost lives and time and resources that Henry needed elsewhere. So they left, moved on to easier targets. Let the fortress stand as a monument to defensive architecture and strategic positioning. Gebhard fled, escaped Salzburg as Henry's forces occupied the city, spent 9 years in exile, moving between allied territories, waiting for political winds to shift. They eventually did. Henry's power weakened. New conflicts emerged. The Pope's position strengthened. And in 1086, Gebhard was invited back to Salzburg, restored to his position, vindicated in his choice to support the Pope against the Emperor. He returned to Hohenwerfen, the fortress that had protected his legacy even when he couldn't be there to defend it. The castle that had stood when everything else fell. And 2 years later, in 1088, he died there, in the fortress he'd built, surrounded by the mountains he'd defended, having won his political battle but paid the price in exile and suffering. His body was carried down the mountain, buried with honor, his name recorded in chronicles, but his fortress remained, would remain for 9 centuries. Long after the investiture controversy was forgotten by everyone except historians. Long after the specific political conflicts that motivated its construction had faded into obscurity. Because Hohenwerfen had proven something crucial, something that would define its role for centuries to come. It was impregnable, unconquerable, a fortress that enemies looked at and decided wasn't worth attacking. That defensive strength, intended to protect Salzburg from external threats, would eventually be turned inward, used not to keep enemies out, but to keep prisoners in. The dungeons that would later hold nobles and archbishops didn't exist yet. The cells carved from rock were still just bedrock. The reputation as a place of suffering and isolation hadn't been earned. But the foundation was laid. The stone was set. The fortress stood ready. And over the next several centuries, Hohenwerfen would transform from defender of the faithful into the most feared prison in the Alps. The castle had learned its purpose, had discovered its strength, and that strength would be used to break men who'd once thought themselves beyond breaking. Chapter 2. The Prince Archbishops and the Dual Purpose. For 4 centuries after Gebhard's death, Hohenwerfen served a dual purpose: military fortress and prison. The Archbishops of Salzburg weren't just religious leaders. They were princes, temporal rulers with armies and treasuries and all the responsibilities of secular government. The Archbishop of Salzburg was one of the most powerful political figures in Central Europe, controlling vast territories, collecting taxes, minting coins, administering justice. And justice, in medieval and early modern Europe, meant imprisonment, torture, execution. Hohenwerfen's remote location made it ideal for this purpose. Far from Salzburg city, difficult to reach, surrounded by mountains that made escape virtually impossible. A fortress where prisoners could be forgotten, where screams wouldn't disturb the comfortable urban life of the capital. The first documented high-ranking prisoner was Archbishop Adalbert III of Bohemia, imprisoned in 1198 by his own subordinates, his own ministeriales, the administrative officials who served the archbishopric. Adalbert had been appointed Archbishop of Salzburg against the will of the local clergy. He was an outsider, a Bohemian, imposed by political forces that had nothing to do with the spiritual needs of Salzburg. His administrators arrested him. A coup, a rejection of imperial authority. They dragged him to Hohenwerfen, locked him in cells designed for common criminals, kept him there until political pressure forced his release. The message was clear. Even an archbishop wasn't safe. Even divine authority meant nothing when political reality intervened. The fortress that had been built to protect the archbishopric would happily consume its own leaders. Count Albert of Friesack followed in 1253, a nobleman, a man of power and wealth. But he'd made enemies, made mistakes. The exact charges are lost to history. Medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, especially when powerful men wanted to erase inconvenient truths. What we know, he was imprisoned at Hohenwerfen. He died there. Whether from disease, starvation, execution, or simple despair, the records don't say. just another name added to the castle's growing list of victims. The dungeons expanded during these centuries, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. As the castle's reputation as a prison grew, so did its capacity to hold prisoners. Cells were carved directly from the rock, small, cold, damp. A single narrow window, if you were lucky, letting in a thin shaft of light. More often, no windows at all, just darkness, stone walls that wept moisture, a heavy wooden door with a small grate for passing food. No heat, not in the medieval period, not even in winter when Alpine temperatures dropped below freezing. Prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they had, huddled in corners, breathed on their hands to keep their fingers from going numb. Some cells were worse than others. Some were barely large enough to lie down in, forced prisoners to remain sitting or standing, their muscles cramping, their joints swelling, their bodies slowly breaking under the strain of unchanging position. And the isolation, total, complete. You might go weeks without seeing another human face. The guard who brought food wouldn't speak, wouldn't acknowledge you as human, would just push a bowl through the grate and leave. Your only companion was silence, and your own thoughts, and the gradual erosion of sanity that comes from having nothing to think about except your own situation. But Hohenwerfen wasn't just a prison. It remained a military installation, a hunting lodge, a place where archbishops would retreat for leisure. The contrast is surreal. Nobles feasting in the great hall, drinking wine, laughing, planning hunts in the surrounding forests, while below their feet, in the dungeons carved from the same mountain, prisoners starved, screamed, died slowly in darkness. Did the nobles hear them? Did the sounds of suffering filter up through stone floors and disturb their meals? Or had they become so accustomed to the presence of imprisoned men that they simply stopped noticing? The 12th century saw major expansions. Archbishop Conrad I, who ruled from 1106 to 1147, strengthened the walls, added towers, improved the defensive capabilities, made Hohenwerfen even more impregnable. But he also expanded the prison facilities. More cells, better doors, stronger locks. As if he understood that the fortress's future lay not in repelling external enemies, but in holding internal ones. The 15th century brought Archbishop Eberhard III. He ruled from 1403 to 1427, and he modernized Hohenwerfen extensively, rebuilt sections to accommodate artillery, the new military technology that was transforming warfare across Europe. Cannons required different defensive architecture, thicker walls to withstand bombardment, lower, broader towers that presented smaller targets, angled bastions that could deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their full impact. Eberhard invested heavily in these improvements, turned Hohenwerfen into a fortress that could withstand siege by the most modern armies. But the dungeons remained unchanged because no amount of military modernization affected the castle's other purpose, its darker purpose, the purpose that would define its legacy more than any battle or siege. By the early 16th century, Hohenwerfen had a reputation. Everyone in Salzburg knew about it, knew what it meant when the archbishop's guards arrived to take you, knew where you were going, knew you might never come back. It was a threat, a tool of control. The archbishop didn't need to imprison everyone who opposed him, just a few, just enough to make an example, to show what happened to those who challenged ecclesiastical authority. And the examples were effective. People learned to keep their mouths shut, to bow when the archbishop passed, to pay their tithes without complaint. Because the alternative was Hohenwerfen, was those cold stone cells, was isolation and darkness and the slow erosion of everything that made you human. But in 1524, everything changed. The peasants had had enough. Across the German-speaking lands, from Bavaria to Tyrol to Salzburg, common people rose up, demanded changes, demanded dignity, demanded relief from the crushing weight of feudal obligations. The German Peasants' War had begun, and Hohenwerfen Castle, symbol of ecclesiastical power, instrument of oppression, prison of the people, was directly in its path. The fortress that had never been conquered by enemies would soon face its greatest threat, not from foreign armies, but from the very people it had been built to control. Chapter 3. The Peasants' War and the Burning of Hohenwerfen. The year is 1525. The German Peasants' War reached Salzburg. Across Central Europe, peasants and miners were in open rebellion, demanding an end to serfdom, demanding fair treatment, demanding rights that nobles and clergy had denied them for centuries. They'd tried peaceful methods, petitions, appeals to lords and bishops, pleas for mercy and justice. They'd been ignored, dismissed, sometimes punished for their audacity in speaking up at all. So they stopped asking, started taking. In Salzburg, the rebellion was particularly intense. The region's economy was built on salt mining and agriculture. The miners and farmers who did the actual work saw little benefit. Most profits flowed to the archbishop and his administration, to nobles who'd never set foot in a mine or plowed a field. The grievances were specific, detailed. The rebels weren't mindless rioters. They had demands, lists of changes they wanted: taxation reform, labor rights, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment. That last one was particularly relevant to Hohenwerfen, because everyone knew someone who'd been taken there: a brother who'd poached a deer from the archbishop's hunting preserve, a father who'd complained too loudly about taxes, a son who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the archbishop needed someone to blame for some minor crime. Hohenwerfen wasn't just a military fortress, it was a symbol of oppression, of the archbishop's power to take people from their homes and families, to lock them away forever with no trial, no appeal, no hope. The rebels decided that symbol needed to fall. In March 1525, peasant armies began moving north from the south of Salzburg province. Thousands of them. Miners from the ore-rich mountains, farmers from valleys, craftsmen from small towns, armed with whatever they could find: axes, hammers, hunting weapons, a few stolen military arms. They burned manor houses as they advanced, destroyed tax records, freed prisoners from local jails, each victory emboldening them, each success proving that the nobles weren't invincible. That power could shift. That change was possible. Word reached Archbishop Matthias Lang von Wellenberg in Salzburg city. His response was immediate: retreat to Hohensalzburg Fortress, the massive castle dominating Salzburg, impregnable, well supplied, capable of withstanding any siege the peasants could mount. Lang fled with his household, his treasury, his most important officials, left the city to be occupied by rebels, calculating correctly that Hohensalzburg could hold indefinitely while the peasant army exhausted itself. But Hohenwerfen? Hohenwerfen was a different calculation. The castle's garrison was small, maybe 30 soldiers, enough to man the walls during peacetime, not nearly enough to resist a determined assault by thousands of attackers. The commander at Hohenwerfen faced an impossible choice: defend the fortress and die, or surrender and hope for mercy. He chose surrender, opened the gates, allowed the peasant army to enter without resistance. It didn't save him. The rebels weren't interested in mercy. They'd marched too far, lost too many friends to noble violence, endured too many years of oppression to suddenly become magnanimous just because a garrison surrendered. The soldiers were executed, all of them. The commander, the guards, everyone who'd worn the Archbishop's colors, everyone who'd locked prisoners in those dungeons, everyone who'd served a system that the rebels wanted destroyed. And then they turned their attention to the castle itself. They freed the prisoners first. Every cell was opened, every lock broken. Men who'd been imprisoned for years stumbled into sunlight they'd thought they'd never see again. Some could barely walk. Some had gone mad in solitary confinement. All were emaciated, broken. Proof of what Hohenwerfen did to human beings. The freed prisoners joined the destruction, guided the rebels to the worst parts of the castle, the torture chambers, the deepest cells, the places where men had screamed and no one had cared. Everything combustible was set alight: furniture, doors, wooden support beams, the chapel's pews, tapestries, records. Centuries of accumulated material went up in flames. The fire burned for days. You could see the smoke from Salzburg, a column of black rising from the mountains, a signal that the peasants had struck a blow against the Archbishop's power. But they didn't destroy the entire castle. Couldn't. Stone doesn't burn. The walls remained. The towers stood. The basic structure survived because medieval military architecture is designed to resist fire, as well as siege weapons. When the flames died down, Hohenwerfen was a shell, blackened, gutted, but not annihilated. The peasants moved on, marched toward Salzburg, besieged Hohensalzburg fortress, where Archbishop Lang had taken refuge. They couldn't breach it. Hohensalzburg was too strong, too well supplied. The siege dragged on for months. The peasant army began to fracture. Disagreements emerged about strategy, about demands, about what they were really fighting for, and then the nobles counterattacked. The Swabian League, an alliance of German princes and cities, sent a professional army, trained soldiers, modern weapons, experienced commanders who'd fought in dozens of campaigns. They crushed the peasant rebellion systematically, battle after battle, victory after victory. The peasants fought bravely, desperately. But bravery doesn't defeat discipline. Desperation doesn't stop cavalry charges. By July 1526, the war was over. The surviving rebels surrendered. Some were executed as examples. Others were allowed to return home after promising loyalty and paying heavy fines. The demands were ignored. The system remained unchanged. Nothing the peasants had fought for was granted. Their rebellion had failed completely. And Archbishop Lang, emerging from Hohensalzburg after months of siege, surveyed the damage to his domain. Hohenwerfen stood ruined, a burned-out hulk, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. He ordered it rebuilt, immediately, spare no expense, make it stronger than before, ensure this could never happen again. But there was a twist, a punishment embedded in the reconstruction. The local peasants, the same communities that had supported the rebellion, that had celebrated when Hohenwerfen burned, were forced to rebuild it. Conscripted labor. No pay. Just the obligation to restore the fortress that had oppressed them. To reconstruct the very symbol of their subjugation. Can you imagine that? Being forced to rebuild your own prison? To quarry the stone? To haul the materials up that mountain? To reconstruct walls and cells and dungeons that might one day hold you or your children? The work took years. The Archbishop's engineers directed the reconstruction, but the labor was provided by the people who'd tried to destroy it. The irony was intentional, deliberate. A message: rebel, and you'll be forced to undo your own resistance. The new Hohenwerfen was stronger than the old. Additional towers, reinforced walls, a concealed staircase for emergency escapes. Everything learned from the peasant attack was incorporated into the redesign. And the dungeons expanded, improved, made more secure. Because the Archbishop had learned something from the rebellion, the threat of imprisonment wasn't enough. The prison had to be inescapable, had to be terrifying, had to break not just bodies, but spirits. By 1535, Hohenwerfen was complete. Beautiful in its way, a Gothic fortress rising from Alpine rock, a triumph of military architecture, and a tomb for anyone unfortunate enough to be imprisoned within its walls. The castle's reputation changed after the Peasants' War. Before, it had been feared. After, it was loathed. Everyone remembered that peasants had freed the prisoners, had burned the fortress, had proved that the Archbishop's power wasn't absolute. And everyone remembered what happened next. The crushing of the rebellion, the forced labor, the restoration of the system exactly as it had been. Hohenwerfen became more than a prison. It became a symbol of the futility of resistance, of the impossibility of change, of power that could be challenged but never truly defeated. And the cells that had been empty during the rebellion, because the peasants had freed everyone, began to fill again. With new prisoners, new victims, new men and women who'd learned that in Salzburg, the Archbishop's word was law, and the penalty for defiance was isolation in a mountain fortress where no one would ever hear you scream. Chapter 4. Wolf Dietrich von Reithenau, the Fallen Prince. The year is 1587. Wolf Dietrich von Reithenau becomes Prince Archbishop of Salzburg at age 28. Young, ambitious, educated at the Collegium Germanicum in Rome, the finest ecclesiastical institution in Europe. Connected to power through blood. His aunt was a sister of Pope Pius IV. His uncle was the Bishop of Constance. He had everything: talent, education, family connections, divine office, temporal power. The future seemed limitless. And then he fell in love. Her name was Salome Alt, daughter of a wealthy merchant, granddaughter of a former mayor of Salzburg. Beautiful. Contemporary accounts describe her as a tall, grown woman and belle of the city. Protestant, which made the relationship even more scandalous in Catholic Salzburg. They met at a wedding party in the Alte Stadttrinkstube. Wolf Dietrich saw her across the room, and something shifted, something that would define the rest of his life and lead directly to his imprisonment and death. He was an archbishop, a prince of the church, bound by vows of celibacy, required to remain unmarried, chaste, devoted entirely to God and his ecclesiastical duties. But he wanted her, loved her perhaps, or maybe just refused to accept that his position should deny him what any secular prince could have: a companion, a family, a life beyond duty and prayer. The affair began around 1593, quietly at first, then less quietly as it became clear that Wolf Dietrich had no intention of ending it, no intention of choosing between his office and this woman. Salome became his mistress, his partner. The relationship lasted 24 years, longer than many marriages of the era, and it produced 15 children. 15. Think about that. An archbishop, a man who'd sworn celibacy, who represented the Catholic Church in one of its most important archbishoprics, openly fathering children with a Protestant merchant's daughter. The scandal should have destroyed him, should have led to immediate deposition. But Wolf Dietrich was too powerful, too well-connected, too skilled at political maneuvering. He petitioned the Pope for permission to marry. Multiple times, the requests were denied. Allowing an archbishop to marry and legitimize 15 children who might inherit church property was impossible. It would set a precedent that could undermine ecclesiastical celibacy across Europe. So they remained unmarried. But Wolf Dietrich ensured Salome and their children lived well. In 1606, he built her a palace, Schloss Altenau, later renamed Mirabell Palace by his successor. Beautiful, Baroque, a monument to his love, or his defiance of ecclesiastical law. Situated just outside Salzburg's city walls because having your mistress and children living inside the city itself would be too brazen even for Wolf Dietrich. He gave Salome money, property, businesses. By 1610, her assets were valued at over 400,000 guilders, an enormous fortune. She owned 80 businesses, farms, inns, mills. Her annual income exceeded 200 guilders from her holdings alone. Wolf Dietrich had essentially made her a noblewoman. In 1609, he secured her ennoblement by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Her children were freed from the legal disadvantages of illegitimacy, as close to legitimacy as an archbishop's children could come without actual marriage. For years, it worked. Wolf Dietrich ruled Salzburg with vision and ambition. He was a builder, a patron of arts, a Renaissance prince in ecclesiastical clothing. When Salzburg Cathedral burned in 1598, he commissioned a magnificent replacement, hired Venetian architect Vincenzo Scamozzi, planned a Baroque masterpiece that would dwarf the old medieval structure, a cathedral worthy of Salzburg's importance. He redesigned the city center, created Residenzplatz, commissioned palaces, brought Italian architects and artists to Salzburg, transformed it from a provincial ecclesiastical seat into a Baroque jewel. But his ambitions exceeded his resources. The cathedral project alone cost enormous sums. His gifts to Salome and their children drained the archbishopric's treasury. His political maneuvering, trying to maintain independence while navigating pressures from the Pope, the Emperor, and neighboring princes, made enemies. And then came the conflict with Bavaria. Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria wanted control of the Salzburg salt trade. Salt was white gold, essential for food preservation. Whoever controlled salt controlled wealth and power. Wolf Dietrich refused Bavaria's demands, asserted Salzburg's independence, prepared for conflict. In October 1611, Bavarian forces invaded Salzburg. Not a small raid, a full military campaign, professional soldiers, modern weapons, led by a duke who was one of the most powerful rulers in the Holy Roman Empire. Wolf Dietrich was unprepared. His treasury was depleted. His own cathedral chapter, the body of priests who'd elected him, had grown tired of his scandals and his spending. They refused to support him. Emperor Rudolph II, who might have intervened, declined. The Pope offered no help. Wolf Dietrich had alienated too many people, made too many enemies. His power base had eroded beneath him. The Bavarian army approached Salzburg. Wolf Dietrich fled, sent Salome and their children to safety in Ansitz-Thurnhof in Flachau. Then he himself retreated, seeking refuge in Carinthia. But his own cathedral chapter acted first. They declared him deposed, invited his nephew, Mark Sittig von Hohenems, to become the new archbishop. And Mark Sittig had Wolf Dietrich arrested. Family betrayal. The ultimate humiliation. Deposed by your own nephew. Stripped of your office by the same ecclesiastical body that had once elected you. Wolf Dietrich was brought back to Salzburg, but not to the residence, the palace where he'd lived as archbishop, not to any place of comfort or dignity, to Hohenwerfen Castle, the prison fortress in the Alps. He arrived in chains, a fallen prince, the man who'd once controlled armies and treasuries and the spiritual life of Salzburg, now reduced to a prisoner in a cell carved from mountain stone. He was given a chamber in the residential section. Not the worst cells, some dignity remained, but he was still imprisoned, still isolated, still stripped of everything that had defined his life. From his window, he could see Salzburg in the distance, the city he'd transformed, the cathedral he'd envisioned rising, though he'd never see it completed. And somewhere below, the Mirabell Palace, where Salome and their children had lived. He couldn't reach them, couldn't communicate with them. Mark Sittig had expelled Salome from Mirabell Palace, sending her and the children away. They fled to Upper Austria, to safety, but also to permanent separation from Wolf Dietrich. He would never see them again, never hold his children, never speak to the woman he'd spent 24 years with, the woman for whom he'd risked everything and ultimately lost everything. He had time to think, 6 years of time. 6 years watching seasons change in the Alps. 6 years of isolation interrupted only by guards bringing food and occasional visitors who came to gawk at the fallen archbishop. On one wall of his chamber, he carved words, his final message, his epitaph written by his own hand. Wolf Dietrich von Reitenau, 1611. Just his name and the year of his imprisonment. A marker. Proof he'd existed. Proof he'd been here. Because everything else had been taken. His office, his power, his family, his future. But not his name. That remained. Carved into stone. Permanent. And beneath it, according to some accounts, another inscription. Love is suffering in the end. Whether he actually wrote these words, or whether later prisoners or visitors added them, is unclear. But they capture the tragedy perfectly. The man who'd chosen love over duty, who'd refused to choose between his life's work and his life's love, who'd tried to have both and ended with neither. He died at Hohenwerfen on January 16, 1617. 6 years of imprisonment. 6 years of isolation, 6 years of watching his dreams and plans continue without him. The cathedral he'd envisioned was being built by Mark Sittig, using Wolf Dietrich's plans, but taking all the credit. The city he'd transformed continued to thrive. The artistic renaissance he'd initiated flourished. Everything he'd worked for succeeded. But he wasn't there to see it. Wasn't there to enjoy it. Died alone in a mountain fortress, his achievements credited to others, his family scattered, his legacy complicated by scandal and failure. His body was brought down from Hohenwerfen, buried in Salzburg Cathedral's crypt, the cathedral he'd commissioned, but never lived to see completed. His tomb is modest, appropriate for a deposed archbishop. Not the grand monument a Renaissance prince might have expected. Salome lived another 16 years, never remarried, raised their children, lived quietly. Died in 1633 at age 65, her life defined by her relationship with a man she'd barely seen for the last decades of her life. Their descendants survived. Several of their children married, had children of their own. The Alt-Altenau line continues to the 21st century. Wolf Dietrich's genes, if not his name, live on. But his imprisonment changed Hohenwerfen's reputation. Before Wolf Dietrich, it had been a prison for commoners and minor nobles, criminals, people who didn't matter. After Wolf Dietrich, everyone knew the fortress could hold anyone, even a prince archbishop. Even a man who'd once controlled the spiritual and temporal life of Salzburg. Even family members of the current ruler. The message was clear. No one was safe. No one was too powerful. No one was beyond the reach of Hohenwerfen's cells. And for the next 2 centuries, that message would define how Salzburg's rulers used their fortress in the mountains. Not just for punishment, but for elimination. For making inconvenient people disappear, for breaking the powerful when they became too powerful. Wolf Dietrich's name remains carved in that wall. Visitors can see it today. Touch the same stone he touched. Stand in the same chamber where he spent 6 years contemplating his failures and victories. The castle remembers him, the most famous prisoner, the fallen prince who chose love and lost everything. And his ghost, according to local legend, still walks those corridors, still looks out that window toward Salzburg, still searching for the life that was taken from him, still suffering, still alone, still paying the price for refusing to choose between duty and desire. Chapter 5. The Dungeons and the Architecture of Suffering. Let's descend into the dungeons. Down stone staircases worn smooth by centuries of feet. Guards bringing prisoners. Priests bringing last rites. Executioners bringing instruments of torture. Each step taking you deeper into the mountain, deeper into darkness, deeper into suffering. The dungeons at Hohenwerfen weren't designed for comfort, weren't designed for rehabilitation or reform. They were designed to break people, to strip away everything that made them human until only obedience or death remained. The cells are small, 8 feet by 10 feet. Stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling, everything cold, everything damp, moisture seeping through the rock, condensing on walls, dripping constantly. That sound, drip, 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 becoming the only measure of time when days blur into weeks and weeks into months. A single, narrow window. Maybe, if you were important enough, if the guards felt merciful. Otherwise, darkness. Complete. Absolute. The kind of darkness that makes you forget what light looks like. That makes you wonder if the sun still exists, if it ever existed, if maybe your entire life before this cell was just a dream. No heat? Not in winter when Alpine temperatures drop below freezing. Not when snow piles 20 feet high outside. Not when your breath crystallizes before it leaves your mouth. Prisoners would huddle in corners, wrap themselves in whatever clothing they had, which often wasn't much. Guards would sometimes remove outer garments as punishment, leave prisoners in thin shirts, watch them shiver, watch them slowly succumb to hypothermia. Some lost fingers to frostbite, toes, ears, the extremities going numb first, then turning black, then falling off. Medieval medicine offered no treatment, no care. You just lived with the loss, if you lived at all. The worst cells were on the lowest level, the deepest, where even in summer, the temperature never rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where dampness was so complete that fungus grew on the walls, where the air smelled of mold and human waste and despair. These cells had no windows, no light except what filtered down through cracks in the door. Prisoners in these cells lost track of time completely. Days became meaningless. The only calendar was the arrival of food, 1 meal per day, pushed through a grate. Count the meals. Try to remember if you've counted this one already or not. Realize after a while that you've lost count, that you don't know if you've been here for weeks or months or years. The silence was worse than the cold, worse than the darkness, because human beings need interaction, need voices, need connection to other humans to maintain sanity. In the deepest cells, you heard nothing. No other prisoners. They were isolated too. No guards chatting. They rarely came down here. No sounds from outside. Just silence. And your own thoughts. And the gradual erosion of your mind under the weight of absolute isolation. Some prisoners talked to themselves, held conversations, played both parts, asked questions and answered them, created imaginary companions to fill the emptiness. The guards reported hearing these conversations. Multiple voices coming from cells that held only one person. Evidence of minds breaking. Of sanity fracturing under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Others scratched marks on the walls, tallies, counting days, 1 mark per day, 5 marks grouped together, trying to maintain some sense of time passing, some connection to the calendar, some proof that they still existed in the same temporal reality as the world outside. You can still see these marks today. Hundreds of them, thousands, covering walls in the lower cells, some careful, methodical, others increasingly erratic, the hand that made them growing less steady as weeks turned into months, as hope faded, as the prisoners stopped caring whether they knew what day it was because every day was the same anyway. And names. Prisoners carved their names, their dates of imprisonment, their crimes, real or alleged. Last messages to families who might never read them. Evidence that they'd existed, that they'd been real people with real lives before this cell consumed them. One inscription stands out, clear, desperate, carved with obvious effort. Hans Müller, 1543. Innocent, God knows the truth. We don't know who Hans Müller was, don't know his crime, don't know if he ever left this cell or died here, but his name remains, his claim of innocence, his appeal to divine justice when human justice had failed him. The torture chamber sits adjacent to the dungeons, connected, convenient, easy to move prisoners from cell to chamber and back again. Not large, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. Stone floor with a slight incline for drainage, because torture produces fluids, blood, urine, vomit, and those fluids needed to flow somewhere. Better to design for easy cleaning than to spend hours scrubbing between sessions. The implements were standard medieval fare: the rack, the strappado, the thumb screws, iron boots that could be heated. Nothing innovative, nothing that hadn't been used in dungeons across Europe for centuries. But the isolation made it worse, made everything worse. Because in most torture chambers, there were witnesses, other prisoners who might report what happened, lawyers or clergy who might intervene, some mechanism, however imperfect, for accountability. At Hohenwerfen, there was nothing. The fortress was remote. The prisoners were isolated. What happened in that chamber stayed in that chamber. Guards could do whatever they wanted, could exceed their authority, could torture for information or for pleasure or for no reason at all. And no one would ever know. Some prisoners confessed to anything, everything, crimes they'd committed and crimes they hadn't, just to make it stop, just to get out of that chamber and back to their cell where at least the pain was passive, where suffering didn't require someone actively inflicting it. But confessions extracted under torture are worthless. Medieval lawyers knew this. The church knew this. Everyone knew that a person in sufficient pain will say whatever their torturer wants to hear. It didn't matter. Because torture at Hohenwerfen wasn't about information. It was about power, about demonstrating that the archbishop, or whoever controlled the fortress, had absolute authority, could break anyone, could reduce even the most powerful prisoners to begging, screaming wrecks. Wolf Dietrich never mentions torture in his letters. Whether he was spared because of his former rank or whether he simply refused to write about it, we don't know. But he was imprisoned for 6 years. 6 years in a fortress where torture was routine. It's hard to believe he wasn't threatened with it at minimum. The dungeons remained in use until the 19th century, even as Enlightenment values spread across. Chapter 5. The Dungeons and the Architecture of Suffering. Let's descend into the dungeons. Down stone staircases worn smooth by centuries of feet. Guards bringing prisoners. Priests bringing last rites. Executioners bringing instruments of torture. Each step taking you deeper into the mountain, deeper into darkness, deeper into suffering. The dungeons at Hohenwerfen weren't designed for comfort, weren't designed for rehabilitation or reform. They were designed to break people, to strip away everything that made them human, until only obedience or death remained. The cells are small, 8 feet by 10 feet. Stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling, everything cold, everything damp, moisture seeping through the rock, condensing on walls, dripping constantly. That sound, drip, 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 becoming the only measure of time when days blur into weeks and weeks into months. A single, narrow window. Maybe, if you were important enough, if the guards felt merciful. Otherwise, darkness. Complete. Absolute. The kind of darkness that makes you forget what light looks like. That makes you wonder if the sun still exists, if it ever existed, if maybe your entire life before this cell was just a dream. No heat? Not in winter when alpine temperatures drop below freezing. Not when snow piles 20 feet high outside. Not when your breath crystallizes before it leaves your mouth. Prisoners would huddle in corners, wrap themselves in whatever clothing they had, which often wasn't much. Guards would sometimes remove outer garments as punishment, leave prisoners in thin shirts, watch them shiver, watch them slowly succumb to hypothermia. Some lost fingers to frostbite, toes, ears, the extremities going numb first, then turning black, then falling off. Medieval medicine offered no treatment, no care. You just lived with the loss, if you lived at all. The worst cells were on the lowest level, the deepest, where even in summer, the temperature never rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where dampness was so complete that fungus grew on the walls, where the air smelled of mold and human waste and despair. These cells had no windows, no light except what filtered down through cracks in the door. Prisoners in these cells lost track of time completely. Days became meaningless. The only calendar was the arrival of food, 1 meal per day, pushed through a grate. Count the meals. Try to remember if you've counted this one already or not. Realize after a while that you've lost count, that you don't know if you've been here for weeks or months or years. The silence was worse than the cold, worse than the darkness, because human beings need interaction, need voices, need connection to other humans to maintain sanity. In the deepest cells, you heard nothing. No other prisoners. They were isolated too. No guards chatting. They rarely came down here. No sounds from outside. Just silence. And your own thoughts. And the gradual erosion of your mind under the weight of absolute isolation. Some prisoners talked to themselves, held conversations, played both parts, asked questions and answered them, created imaginary companions to fill the emptiness. The guards reported hearing these conversations. Multiple voices coming from cells that held only one person. Evidence of minds breaking. Of sanity fracturing under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Others scratched marks on the walls, tallies, counting days, 1 mark per day, 5 marks grouped together, trying to maintain some sense of time passing, some connection to the calendar, some proof that they still existed in the same temporal reality as the world outside. You can still see these marks today. Hundreds of them, thousands, covering walls in the lower cells, some careful, methodical, others increasingly erratic, the hand that made them growing less steady as weeks turned into months, as hope faded, as the prisoner stopped caring whether they knew what day it was because every day was the same anyway. And names. Prisoners carved their names, their dates of imprisonment, their crimes, real or alleged. Last messages to families who might never read them. Evidence that they'd existed, that they'd been real people with real lives before this cell consumed them. One inscription stands out, clear, desperate, carved with obvious effort. Hans Müller, 1543. Innocent, God knows the truth. We don't know who Hans Müller was, don't know his crime, don't know if he ever left this cell or died here. But his name remains, his claim of innocence, his appeal to divine justice when human justice had failed him. The torture chamber sits adjacent to the dungeons, connected, convenient, easy to move prisoners from cell to chamber and back again. Not large, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. Stone floor with a slight incline for drainage, because torture produces fluids, blood, urine, vomit, and those fluids needed to flow somewhere. Better to design for easy cleaning than to spend hours scrubbing between sessions. The implements were standard medieval fare: the rack, the strappado, the thumb screws, iron boots that could be heated. Nothing innovative, nothing that hadn't been used in dungeons across Europe for centuries. But the isolation made it worse, made everything worse. Because in most torture chambers, there were witnesses, other prisoners who might report what happened, lawyers or clergy who might intervene, some mechanism, however imperfect, for accountability. At Hohenwerfen, there was nothing. The fortress was remote. The prisoners were isolated. What happened in that chamber stayed in that chamber. Guards could do whatever they wanted, could exceed their authority, could torture for information or for pleasure or for no reason at all. And no one would ever know. Some prisoners confessed to anything, everything, crimes they'd committed and crimes they hadn't, just to make it stop, just to get out of that chamber and back to their cell where at least the pain was passive, where suffering didn't require someone actively inflicting it. But confessions extracted under torture are worthless. Medieval lawyers knew this. The church knew this. Everyone knew that a person in sufficient pain will say whatever their torturer wants to hear. It didn't matter. Because torture at Hohenwerfen wasn't about information. It was about power, about demonstrating that the archbishop, or whoever controlled the fortress, had absolute authority, could break anyone, could reduce even the most powerful prisoners to begging, screaming wrecks. Wolf Dietrich never mentions torture in his letters. Whether he was spared because of his former rank or whether he simply refused to write about it, we don't know. But he was imprisoned for 6 years. 6 years in a fortress where torture was routine. It's hard to believe he wasn't threatened with it at minimum. The dungeons remained in use until the 19th century, even as Enlightenment values spread across Europe, even as other nations reformed their prison systems, even as torture became officially forbidden. Hohenwerfen continued. Prisoners continued to be held in medieval cells, to suffer in medieval conditions, to be forgotten in mountain darkness. The last official prisoner was released in 1898. After that, the dungeons were officially closed, no longer used for their original purpose. But they remain, preserved, open to tourists who can walk through cells where men died, touch walls where prisoners scratched their final messages, stand in the torture chamber where suffering was inflicted methodically, professionally, without mercy. And some visitors report feeling something, a presence, a weight in the air, that same sense of being watched that prisoners must have felt, as if the stones themselves absorbed the pain, held onto it, refused to let it go even now, centuries after the last scream echoed through these chambers. The dungeons are the heart of Hohenwerfen's dark legacy. Not the military victories, not the architectural achievements, not the famous prisoners or dramatic escapes. Just these cells, these stone boxes where human beings were placed and forgotten, where suffering was concentrated and prolonged, where the powerful demonstrated their power by reducing others to nothing. That's what Hohenwerfen really is. That's its true purpose. Not a fortress, a machine, designed to break human beings, to crush resistance, to turn people into examples of what happens when you challenge authority. And it worked. For centuries, it worked. The dungeons stand empty now, silent. But the stones remember, the walls remember. And the darkness, that same darkness that filled these cells when prisoners had no light, no hope, no future, that darkness remains. Waiting, always waiting, for the next time power needs to demonstrate what it can do to those who defy it. Chapter 6. The Nazi Era and the Austrian Police. The year is 1938. The Anschluss. Nazi Germany annexes Austria. It's bloodless, mostly. Austrian Nazi supporters celebrate in the streets. Others, Jews, political opponents, anyone who'd resisted, are rounded up, arrested. Chapter 7. Where Eagles Dare and Cinematic Immortality. January 1968. A film crew arrives in Werfen. 300 people. Trucks loaded with equipment, cameras, lights, costumes, everything needed to transform Hohenwerfen Castle into Schloss Adler, the fictional Nazi fortress at the heart of one of the most ambitious war films ever attempted. The film is Where Eagles Dare, directed by Brian G. Hutton, starring Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood, written by Alistair MacLean, who wrote the screenplay and novel simultaneously, delivering both in just 6 weeks. The plot: Allied commandos parachute into the Bavarian Alps. Their mission: rescue an American general held prisoner in a mountaintop fortress. But the mission isn't what it seems. Betrayal, double agents, a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone suspects. And Hohenwerfen Castle, standing in for the fictional Schloss Adler, becomes the film's star. The location that makes everything possible. That transforms a good script into a cinematic masterpiece. Producer Elliot Kastner had one crucial duty: secure permission to film at Hohenwerfen. This wasn't trivial. The castle was still being used by the Austrian gendarmerie as a police training camp. Active duty. Working facility. Not set up for film productions. But Kastner persuaded them, negotiated access, arranged for filming to proceed even while police training continued in other sections of the castle. The logistics were complicated, the compromises extensive, but the result was worth it. Because Hohenwerfen offered something no studio set could provide: authenticity, reality, a genuine medieval fortress perched on an Alpine peak, walls that had witnessed 9 centuries of history, an atmosphere of power and imprisonment that you can't fake with plywood and paint. The crew arrived in early January. Winter, the worst possible time to film in the Alps. Temperatures below freezing. Snow everywhere. Dangerous conditions for cast and crew. But those conditions were essential. The story required winter, required snow, required that brutal alpine cold that makes every breath visible, every movement exhausting. Cinematographer Arthur Ibbotson, who would go on to shoot Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, exploited the winter light brilliantly, turned every frame into silver steel, made the castle look even more imposing, even more impregnable than it appears in summer. "There's no fake snow in those shots," Ibbotson said later. "Everyone's breath you see is real." The production wasn't easy. Filming in a medieval fortress in winter creates problems. No heating in many areas, no modern electrical systems for lighting, narrow staircases and corridors that make moving equipment difficult, stone floors that become ice slick in freezing temperatures, and the altitude. Hohenwerfen sits 623 meters above sea level. The surrounding peaks go much higher. Cast and crew weren't accustomed to alpine conditions. Simple activities became exhausting. Breathing was harder. Cold penetrated more deeply. Burton and Eastwood handled it professionally. Both were experienced actors. Both understood that discomfort creates authenticity on screen, that audiences can tell the difference between actors pretending to be cold and actors who actually are cold. Though they joked about it, dubbed the film Where Doubles Dare because so much screen time featured stunt doubles during action sequences. Professional stuntmen did the dangerous work, hanging from cable cars, fighting on rooftops, falling from heights. Burton and Eastwood did the dialogue scenes and close-ups. Legendary stuntman Yakima Canutt served as second unit director, shot most of the action sequences. Canutt had worked on Ben-Hur, Stagecoach, Spartacus, basically every major action film of the previous 3 decades. He knew how to stage spectacle safely. British stuntman Alf Joint doubled for Burton in the cable car fight sequence. One of the most famous scenes in the film, 2 men fighting atop a moving cable car suspended hundreds of feet above an Alpine valley. Dangerous, potentially deadly, requiring precision choreography and absolute trust in equipment. The cable car itself was filmed at Feuerkogel Mountain Lift in Ebensee, Austria, about 40 miles from Hohenwerfen. The real cable car connecting mountain to valley through a 1,500-foot drop. Scenes showing both cable car and castle together used a scale model, combining practical locations with miniature effects. Other Austrian locations included Lofer for village scenes, Eigenem Enstal for airfield sequences, Werfen itself for the train station and high Alpine huts. The production spread across the region, using everything the Austrian landscape offered. The German uniforms caused problems. The swastikas, the SS insignia. This was just 23 years after World War II. Many Austrians had lived through Nazi occupation. Some had fought for Germany. Others had resisted. All had memories. Walking into a bar wearing those uniforms, even for just a minute, even clearly marked as actors in a film production, could stop all conversation, could create tension, could resurrect trauma that people had spent decades trying to forget. Director Brian Hutton remembered, walking into a bar in those uniforms, even for a minute, could stop all conversation. Ebensee itself had been the site of a concentration camp subcamp, part of the Mauthausen complex. Thousands had died there, and now a film crew showed up wearing Nazi uniforms, shooting action sequences, playing war games in the same landscape where real war had caused real suffering. The locals were professional, cooperative. They understood this was fiction, that the film was actually about defeating Nazis, not celebrating them. But the discomfort was real, the history too recent, the wounds not fully healed. An accident during filming left Kastner and Hutton badly burned. The details are unclear, accounts vary. But something went wrong during an action sequence. Fire, explosions, things that are carefully controlled but still dangerous. They recovered. Filming continued. The production wrapped in July 1968 after 6 months of work across Austria and at MGM British Studios in England for interior scenes. The film premiered on January 22, 1969. Royal premiere at the Empire, Leicester Square Cinema in London. Princess Alexandra attended. Burton and director Hutton were present. Eastwood was absent, filming 2 Mules for Sister Sarah in Mexico. Where Eagles Dare was a massive commercial success, earned over $6 million in North America in its first year. Huge numbers for 1969. It became the 7th most popular film at the UK box office that year. 13th in the US. Critics praised the action sequences, the cinematography, the performances. Some found the plot confusing. MacLane's screenplay involves multiple twists, betrayals, revelations. You need to pay attention to follow who's really working for whom. But audiences loved it. The film became a classic, a benchmark for action thrillers, referenced in countless later films, quoted, parodied, analyzed, And Hohenwerfen became famous, internationally recognized, no longer just a castle in Austria, but the Schloss Adler, the fortress that eagles dare to assault. Tourism increased immediately. People who'd seen the film wanted to visit the real location, walk through the same courtyards, stand on the same battlements, experience the fortress that had seemed so imposing on screen. The castle owners embraced this, created a Where Eagles Dare exhibition, display cases showing photographs from the filming, costume pieces, props, information about the production. Visitors can stand where Burton stood, look out windows Eastwood looked through, walk corridors that appear in the film's most dramatic sequences. The film gave Hohenwerfen a second life, a new identity. For centuries, it had been defined by imprisonment, by suffering, by the powerful breaking the weak. Now it was also defined by cinema, by adventure, by a fictional story where the good guys win, where the fortress is stormed successfully, where courage and cleverness defeat Nazi tyranny. It's a better story than the real ones, more satisfying, easier to digest than the reality of Wolf Dietrich dying in isolation or prisoners scratching marks on dungeon walls. But both stories are true. Both are part of what Hohenwerfen is: the fortress of fiction and the fortress of fact, the movie set and the medieval prison, the place where eagles dared and the place where powerful men were broken. The film didn't erase the darkness, didn't change the dungeons or remove the torture chamber or alter the historical record. It just added another layer, another chapter, another way for people to understand and relate to a fortress that had stood for 9 centuries and would stand for 9 more. Today, guides mention the film, point out filming locations, show visitors where specific scenes were shot. It's part of the tour now, part of the castle's identity. But they also show the dungeons, still show the cells where prisoners suffered, still explain the castle's real history alongside its cinematic fame. Because Hohenwerfen is both prison and movie set, monument to suffering and monument to adventure, a fortress that broke real people and a fortress where fictional heroes triumphed. The stones don't distinguish, don't care whether the people who walked through these halls were prisoners or actors, whether the screams were real or performed for cameras. The walls remember everything, the triumphs and the tragedies, the historical and the fictional, all of it absorbed into centuries-old stone that will outlast every film print, every digital copy, every memory of everyone who ever visited. The castle endures, as it always has, as it always will. And Where Eagles Dare ensured that when people think of Hohenwerfen, they think of adventure alongside imprisonment, of victory alongside suffering, of eagles soaring alongside prisoners trapped in darkness. Both true, both real, both part of the fortress's eternal story. Chapter 8: Ghosts, Legends, and What Remains. Walk through Hohenwerfen today and you'll see tourists, families, school groups, people taking photographs, buying souvenirs, watching the falconry demonstrations that have become one of the castle's main attractions. The Birds of Prey Center opened in 1990. Daily flight shows featuring eagles, falcons, hawks, vultures, the birds soaring against the Alpine backdrop, diving, hunting, demonstrating the skills that made them valuable to medieval nobility. It's beautiful, spectacular, the kind of show that makes visitors gasp and applaud, that creates memories they'll treasure for years. But stay past closing time. Stay after the tourists leave, after the falconers pack up their birds, after the gift shop closes and the guides go home. That's when Hohenwerfen shows its other face. the face it wore for centuries before it became a tourist destination, before film crews arrived, before anyone thought a medieval prison could be transformed into family entertainment. The castle staff know. They don't talk about it officially. Don't include it in promotional materials. Don't want to scare visitors or develop a reputation as a haunted location. But among themselves, they share stories, experiences, the things that happen when you work alone in a 900-year-old fortress built on suffering and power. The most commonly reported phenomenon is footsteps, heavy boots on stone floors, military cadence, coming from empty corridors, approaching doors that don't open, passing by windows where no one appears. Guards patrolling? Possible. But the footsteps continue in sections where guards never walked, in areas that were always civilian, in patterns that don't match any historical guard route. And they stop when you investigate. You hear them coming, turn to look, and silence. Complete silence. As if whoever or whatever was walking simply ceased to exist the moment you acknowledged them. Then there's the sobbing. A woman crying, heartbroken, inconsolable. The sound echoing through the upper residential chambers where Wolf Dietrich was held, where nobility lived when the castle functioned as a hunting lodge. Staff have searched for sources, checked for visitors who might be upset. Found nothing. The sobbing continues, always in the same areas, always with the same quality of absolute grief. Some believe it's Salome, Wolf Dietrich's mistress, the woman who lost everything when he was imprisoned, who was exiled from her palace, separated from her children, who spent 16 years knowing the man she loved was locked in a mountain fortress and she'd never see him again. Does grief that profound leave traces? Can emotional pain so intense imprint on physical space? Can love denied and lives destroyed create echoes that persist for centuries? The castle doesn't answer these questions, just presents the phenomena, leaves interpretation to those who experience them. In the dungeons, the reports are different, darker, more disturbing. Multiple staff members refuse to go there alone, won't close up the lower cells by themselves, insist on pairs when work requires entering those spaces. Why? They describe a presence, not specific, not identifiable, just the overwhelming sense that something is there, in the deepest cells, in the corners where light doesn't reach, something that watches, that notices when you're there, that doesn't want you there but can't do anything except wait for you to leave. Temperature drops are common. You'll be walking through a corridor, temperature normal, and suddenly, without passing a window or entering a different section, the air becomes ice cold. 20-degree drop in seconds. Your breath fogging, skin prickling with goosebumps. Stay in that cold spot and you'll feel sick, nauseous, dizzy, your body rejecting the space, warning you that something is wrong, that you need to leave. Move 10 feet and the temperature normalizes, back to normal, as if the cold exists in a specific location, a bubble, a zone where something different applies. One staff member, a maintenance worker responsible for repairs, reported an experience in the torture chamber. He was alone, midday, plenty of light from the narrow windows, nothing spooky about the moment. He felt a hand on his shoulder, heavy, real, pressing down with weight that couldn't be imagination. He spun around, no one there, room empty, door closed, no way for anyone to have entered without him hearing. But the hand had been real. He'd felt it, the weight, the pressure, the fingers gripping his shoulder. He left immediately, told his supervisor he wouldn't work alone in that chamber anymore, wasn't willing to risk whatever had touched him deciding to do more than touch. The supervisor didn't argue, didn't mock him. Just adjusted schedules, so maintenance work in certain areas always involved pairs. Because the supervisor had his own experiences, his own stories, things he didn't talk about, but understood perfectly. Then there are the sightings, actual visual apparitions, less common than sounds or feelings, but reported consistently enough to be documented. A man in medieval clothing, pacing the upper corridors, moving with purpose, looking distressed, mouth moving as if speaking, but no sound emerging. He appears briefly, seconds, long enough to be seen clearly, long enough for witnesses to note details, the style of his clothing, the expression on his face, the way he wrings his hands as he walks. And then he vanishes, simply ceases to exist. Not fading, not walking through a wall, just gone, as if he were never there. Is it Wolf Dietrich, reliving his 6 years of imprisonment, still pacing those corridors centuries after his death? Or is it someone else? Another prisoner? One of the hundreds who suffered here? One of the forgotten men whose names weren't important enough to record? The castle doesn't specify, doesn't provide identification, just shows the figure and lets witnesses draw their own conclusions. In one of the lower cells, visitors have reported seeing a man sitting in the corner, huddled, head in hands, not moving, not reacting to their presence. They'll stare, try to process what they're seeing, wonder if it's a reenactor or a very dedicated method actor, and then they'll blink, or turn to call someone, or reach for their camera, and he's gone. The corner empty, as if he were never there. But the sense of sadness remains, that overwhelming grief that makes visitors want to cry, that makes them understand on a visceral level what it must have been like to be imprisoned here, to have hope gradually extinguished, to realize you'll never leave these cells alive. The castle acknowledges its dark history, doesn't shy away from it. The tours discuss Wolf Dietrich's imprisonment, explain the dungeon's purpose, show the torture chamber without sanitizing what happened there, but they don't discuss the hauntings, don't mention the phenomena, don't include supernatural elements in the official narrative. That's left to visitors to discover, to experience, to interpret based on their own beliefs and tolerances for the unexplained. Some leave convinced they've encountered something genuine, something that can't be explained by psychology or suggestion or imagination. They've felt the cold, heard the sobbing, seen figures that shouldn't exist. Others leave skeptical, attribute everything to old buildings making strange sounds, to imagination filling empty spaces, to the power of suggestion when you know you're standing where suffering occurred. Both groups are right. Both groups are wrong. Because Hohenwerfen isn't just one thing, isn't just a haunted castle or a historical monument or a tourist attraction or a film location. It's all of these, simultaneously. A fortress that has absorbed 9 centuries of human experience. Power and suffering, ambition and defeat, love and betrayal, life and death. The stones don't judge, don't distinguish between categories. They just hold everything. Remember everything. Present everything to those willing to pay attention. Today, Hohenwerfen stands as both warning and attraction. Monument to how power corrupts and how suffering endures and how history never really ends, just transforms into new forms, new stories, new ways of understanding what humans do to each other. The dungeons remain. The cells where prisoners carved their names. The torture chamber where pain was professionally inflicted. The corridors where Wolf Dietrich paced for 6 years. The windows where he looked out at freedom he'd never taste again. All preserved, all accessible, all there for anyone who wants to understand what fortresses like this really were, what they really did, what purposes they served beyond defense and architecture. The eagles from the falconry center soar above. Tourists photograph them against the Alpine sky. Children watch in wonder as these magnificent birds demonstrate their skills. And below, in the dungeons, in the darkness, in the cold stone cells, something else remains. Something that won't soar, won't fly, won't ever leave. The prisoners who never left, the suffering that soaked into stone, the memories that walls won't release. Hohenwerfen Castle, prison fortress of the Alps, monument to power, monument to suffering, monument to the inescapable truth that what we build to contain others eventually contains us too. The fortress stands, has stood for 9 centuries, will stand for 9 more, long after every current visitor is dead, long after every film print of Where Eagles Dare has degraded, long after every tour guide has retired, and every falcon has died, and every photograph has been deleted. The stones remain, the walls remember, the dungeons wait, and the castle, beautiful and terrible, magnificent and monstrous, continues its eternal watch over the valley, over the tourists who marvel at medieval architecture, over the eagles that soar freely above walls built to imprison, over the ghosts who can't leave, who pace corridors, who sob in empty rooms, who wait for freedom that never comes. The fortress endures, as it always has, as it always will, forever.